When the sound of my bone breaking filled the living room, I knew nothing in my life would ever be the same again. Richard Hayes, the man who had married my mother and called himself my stepfather, stood over me with a leather belt clenched in his fist, his chest heaving with rage, his eyes wild and bloodshot. I was 23 years old, and in that moment I was no longer a person to him, only an obstacle he needed to crush. The belt had whistled through the air before slamming against my arm, and the snap that followed was not the leather, but my own body giving way. Pain exploded through me hot and sharp, and I collapsed onto the hardwood floor screaming. My arm bent at an angle that was not human, and when I tried to move it, a wave of nausea rolled through me. I gasped for breath, staring up at the man who had just broken me. "Do you understand now, Anna?" he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls like a curse. "You will obey me, or I will break more than your arm." He pressed his boot onto my chest, forcing the air out of my lungs, and for a moment I thought he would finish what he started. Behind him, my mother Linda stood frozen in the doorway, her hand clutching the frame so tightly her knuckles turned white, her lips trembling as she whispered, "Richard, please stop." But her voice was too soft, too small, drowned out by his fury. He turned his head and sneered at her. "Do you want me to teach you a lesson too?" She shook her head silent, her eyes full of tears, but her body unmoving. She had always been like that, paralyzed watching, but never intervening, whispering that I should not provoke him, that silence was safer. I looked at her through the haze of agony and realized she would not save me. The man she chose over her own daughter had taken everything from both of us, and still she stood there trembling but obedient. Richard leaned down so close I could smell the alcohol on his breath, his voice dropping to a hiss. "You think your father's money makes you strong, but it makes you mine. Everything you have belongs to me. You will sign, you will obey, or you will bleed." He shoved the belt onto my stomach like a trophy, then pulled me up by the collar of my shirt and shoved me toward the door. "Get out," he growled. "This is my house now. Find somewhere else to crawl and die." My body shook from pain, my vision blurred with tears, but I stumbled toward the stairs, clutching my shattered arm against my chest. I wanted to scream at my mother, beg her to come with me, but when I turned, she had already lowered her eyes, as if pretending not to see would erase what had just happened. In that instant, something inside me hardened. He thought he had broken me, but what he had done was ignite something far stronger than fear. He had handed me the proof of what he was, and one day soon I promised myself his own violence would be the weapon that destroyed him. Before the night my stepfather shattered my arm with a belt, I had already been living in a prison of silence for 8 long years, and that prison had been built brick by brick since the day my father died. I was 15 when the accident happened, a rainy night on the highway that stole him from us without warning. My mother Linda broke down completely, and in her desperation she let Richard Hayes into our lives. He came as a savior, or at least that was the mask he wore in the beginning. He arrived with polished shoes, expensive cologne, and promises that he would take care of us. He took my mother to dinners she could not afford, brought flowers that filled the kitchen with color, and told her she deserved to feel alive again. Within a year, he had convinced her to marry him, and from that moment, the mask began to slip. At first, it was the little things, questions about where I was going, who I was texting, why I needed new clothes, why I wanted to go out with friends. He called it concern, but his eyes carried calculation. He criticized the way my mother dressed the meals she cooked, the money she spent. Slowly, the air in the house shifted from mourning to tension. I remember being 17 and standing in the kitchen arguing about staying late at the library when his hand flew across my face so fast I barely saw it coming. My mother rushed forward with an ice pack whispering, "Do not provoke him. Anna, please, just do what he says." That became her mantra. Do not provoke him. Silence is safer. From then on, I learned to live measuring every word and step because Richard demanded absolute control. He decided how much money my mother was allowed to spend, where I was permitted to go, even how loudly we could speak in the evenings when he wanted quiet. He turned the house into a stage where he played the role of master and we played the role of obedient shadows. When I turned 20, I thought about leaving, but my father had left me a small inheritance and a modest house in my name. It was the last piece of him that belonged to me, and Richard hated it. He could not stand that a girl barely out of her teens had property and money beyond his reach. He began pressing papers into my hands, documents I did not fully understand demanding signatures. He insisted that as the man of the house, he should manage everything that my father would have wanted him to. Each time I refused, his fury deepened. My mother begged me quietly to give in, saying it would make things easier. Easier for her, she meant not for me. Every refusal became another reason for Richard to lash out. His words were poison. He told me I was worthless, that nobody would ever believe me if I accused him that I was dramatic, spoiled, ungrateful. And when words were not enough, he used his fists, his hands, his belt. My mother stood by, shrinking further into silence. I watched her transform from a woman who used to sing in the kitchen to one who flinched at footsteps. Richard played the part of a charming man to the outside world, smiling at neighbors, shaking hands at church, laughing with co-workers. Behind closed doors, he was a tyrant. He drank heavily at night, and every sip made his temper sharper. He grabbed my hair, dragged me across floors, left bruises that I hid beneath long sleeves. He slammed doors so hard the glass rattled, cursed me until I trembled, and then demanded obedience, as if his rage had never happened. Yet, through all of it, the inheritance remained out of his reach, and that made him more dangerous. It was not only about controlling my movements or my mother's voice, it was about owning everything I had left of my father. That money, that house represented defiance to him, and defiance was something he could not allow. I knew he was escalating. The slaps had become punches, the shouts had become threats. He told me once, while standing inches from my face, that he could make me disappear and nobody would care. He said the police would laugh if I ever called them that my mother would cover for him, that I would end up with nothing. The terrifying part was that I believed him. Every night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening for his footsteps, dreading the sound of the belt sliding through the loops of his pants. My body carried bruises, my mind carried fear, and my heart carried anger. I kept telling myself if I could survive long enough, finish college, save some money, I could escape. But the truth was, Richard was not going to let me walk away quietly. He wanted everything. He wanted my obedience, my silence, and ultimately, my inheritance. That was why, on the night he swung that belt with such force that my arm snapped, he was not only punishing me for disobedience, he was trying to erase me as a threat. What he did not know was that breaking my arm would be the last time he would ever break anything of mine. After my arm broke under the weight of Richard's belt, I thought for a moment that maybe the worst had already happened, but the truth was that it was only the beginning. He was furious not because I had resisted him, but because in breaking me, he had not yet achieved his ultimate goal. Richard wanted control of everything I had left of my father. He wanted the house in my name, the modest inheritance accounts, and whatever dignity I still possessed. That night, while I lay in my room cradling my broken arm, he stood outside my door, pounding until the wood rattled, shouting that if I thought this was pain, I had no idea what real pain looked like. He told me he could crush my ribs until I could not breathe, that he could put me in the hospital, and nobody would believe it was his fault. My mother's voice floated weakly through the hall, pleading with him to calm down, but her words were thin air against the hurricane of his rage. For days, he stalked me around the house like a predator circling wounded prey. When I tried to eat, he slammed his fist against the table. When I attempted to leave for class, he grabbed my backpack, yanked me back by my hair, and locked the door. He told me that until I signed the papers he had prepared, I would never know peace again. I began hiding my phone beneath my pillow, recording his rants through the thin walls. I could not lift heavy things with my injured arm, but I could hold onto evidence, and that became my weapon. Late one night, while he passed out in the recliner with a half-empty bottle of whiskey, I slipped into his study. His desk was a mess of papers, bills, and envelopes, but at the center was a folder marked urgent. I opened it and my blood ran cold. These were loan applications and property transfer forms, all in my name, but the signatures were forged. My name sprawled across the bottom in handwriting that was not mine. He had been applying for loans and credit lines, pretending to be me, using my father's inheritance as collateral. If any of them were approved, I would be drowning in debt before I even graduated college. The terror twisted in my stomach, but so did fury. Richard was not just a violent bully. He was a thief, methodically trying to strip me of everything. I snapped photos of the documents with my phone, then slid the folder back exactly where it was. My hands shook, but my mind felt sharper than it ever had. Now I had proof not only of his violence, but of his fraud. The next morning, he cornered me in the kitchen with another stack of papers. "Sign these, Anna," he barked, shoving them toward me. "You will never survive on your own. You are weak. You are nothing without me." My arm throbbed in its makeshift sling, but I forced my eyes to meet his. "No," I whispered. He slammed his fist down so hard the salt shaker toppled off the counter. "You will regret this." My mother flinched from the doorway but said nothing. He advanced on me, belt in hand again, but this time I lifted my phone and hit record in plain sight. His eyes widened for a fraction of a second, then narrowed with rage. "You think anyone will believe you?" he growled. "I will tell them you are a liar, an unstable little brat." He struck the table with the belt inches from my hand, the crack like a gunshot. I did not flinch. For the first time, he saw that I was not completely broken, and that made him even more dangerous. Over the next week, his behavior spiraled. He smashed my phone against the wall one night thinking he had silenced me, but he did not know I had already uploaded everything to a cloud drive. He yanked the suitcase from under my bed when he discovered I was trying to pack and hurled it against the wall clothes, scattering like shrapnel. He whispered threats through the crack in my door, promising to make me disappear. And still, I endured, recording every word, every blow, every scream. My body was bruised, my ribs ached, my arm throbbed, but my determination only grew. My mother sat across from me at dinner one evening, her eyes hollow. "Anna, please just sign," she begged. "If you do, he will calm down. If you do, we can have peace." I looked at her, and for the first time I realized she had been broken long before me. She was not asking for my safety, she was asking for her silence. I shook my head and told her quietly that peace built on submission was not peace at all. That night, Richard stumbled into my room reeking of alcohol, waving another document. "You will sign this deed," he slurred, "or I swear I will put you in the hospital." He grabbed my cast and squeezed until I screamed. I thought I would pass out from the pain, but I held his gaze and hissed back that one day soon he would regret underestimating me. His laugh was cruel and sharp, but behind it I saw the flicker of doubt. He knew I was not the same terrified girl anymore. The escalation reached its peak when he dragged me into the living room during one of his rages and forced me into a chair. He paced back and forth, belt in hand, ranting about how everything in this house belonged to him. How I was ungrateful, how my father had left me money I did not deserve. My mother stood trembling in the corner, muttering, "Please stop," but he ignored her. "Sign these papers," he roared, thrusting them into my lap. "You will not walk away from me. You are mine." I stared at the documents, my father's name printed on them, my forged signature scrawled at the bottom, and something inside me snapped harder than my arm. I tore the papers in half right in front of him. His face turned purple, his eyes bulged, and for a moment I thought he might kill me then and there. He lunged forward, belt raised, but I held up my phone recording. His roar of fury filled the room as the belt cracked against the table. My mother screamed. I whispered into the phone, loud enough to be captured, Richard Hayes threatening me with violence, demanding property transfers, forging my signature. His face twisted when he realized I was narrating his crimes as they happened. He stormed out of the room, hurling curses, but I knew I had won a small battle. I had evidence. The escalation was not only breaking me, it was building the case that would end him. The night I finally escaped that house was not with a plan, but with desperation. My arm was in a makeshift sling. My ribs screamed every time I breathed, and the bruises covering my body told the story my mother refused to speak. Richard had stormed out after another fit of rage, shouting that he would find a way to ruin me completely. When his car finally roared down the street, I grabbed my backpack, stuffed it with what little I could carry, and slipped out into the night. I took the bus to the nearest hospital, collapsing into the emergency room under the harsh fluorescent lights. The nurse gasped when she saw the angle of my arm and the discoloration on my skin. "What happened?" she demanded, and for a second I almost repeated the lie I had trained myself to say. "I fell. I slipped. It was an accident." But the words caught in my throat, and all I could hear was Richard's voice telling me nobody would believe me. I looked the nurse in the eye and whispered my stepfather did this. It was like releasing poison from my lungs. She called security, and within minutes 2 police officers appeared. They looked at me with suspicion, at first asking if I was exaggerating, if there was some misunderstanding. Then I pulled out my phone, the screen cracked but still working, and played the recordings. Richard's voice boomed from the speaker. Threats, curses, the snap of a belt, the sound of me crying out. The officers exchanged glances, their doubt replaced by grim determination. "This is enough to open an investigation," one of them said. They took copies of my files, but I knew investigations could take weeks, maybe months. Richard was clever manipulative, and he had my mother still under his control. I needed someone who could fight him in a language he could not twist. That someone arrived the next morning in the form of Mark Thompson, a lawyer the hospital social worker had called. He was a tall man with gray at his temples and sharp eyes that softened when he saw me. He introduced himself as an old colleague of my father's, someone who had handled small legal matters years ago. When he listened to my story, his jaw tightened with anger. "Anna, what your stepfather has done is not just abuse. It is fraud, coercion, and financial exploitation. He has broken multiple laws." I showed him the photos of the forged documents, the loan applications, the property transfer forms. He scanned them quickly and nodded. "These are enough to bury him. With your testimony and this evidence, we can bring charges that will stick." For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of hope. Richard's violence had always been his shield, but now his own words, his own handwriting, his own arrogance had become weapons against him. Mark moved quickly, filing motions for a restraining order, contacting the district attorney, and securing my evidence in official records. Meanwhile, Richard began calling my phone over and over, leaving messages dripping with fury. "You think you are clever, Anna. You think anyone will believe you. I own your mother, I own this house, and soon I will own you." Each voicemail was another nail in his coffin. Mark told me to save everyone. He explained that judges and juries do not just hear words, they see patterns, and Richard was drawing the clearest pattern of guilt I had ever seen. But the twist that changed everything came when the police dug deeper into his financials. They discovered that the loans he had applied for under my name were not the only ones. He had opened accounts tied to shell companies routed through his work contacts. It was larger than just stealing my inheritance. He was running a small-scale fraud scheme using me as the scapegoat. The DA added financial fraud to the list of charges, and suddenly Richard was not just an abusive stepfather. He was a criminal facing years behind bars. My mother called me one night, her voice trembling. "Anna, please do not go through with this," she whispered. "He is furious. He says if you testify, you will regret it forever." I took a deep breath and told her quietly, "I already regret not standing up sooner." Her silence on the line told me she was still trapped, but I could not let that stop me. Mark explained the next step would be court, and the thought of standing in front of Richard terrified me, but it also filled me with a cold determination. I imagined his face when the jury heard his voice threatening me when they saw his forged signatures, and I knew I had to follow through. The morning of the preliminary hearing, I walked into the courthouse with Mark by my side, my cast still visible, my body still aching, but my resolve unshaken. Richard was there at the defense table, wearing a pressed suit, his hair slicked back, his smile aimed at the judge as if he were the picture of respectability. But when his eyes met mine, I saw the flicker of panic. He knew the evidence was coming, and this time he could not scream it away. The prosecutor presented the audio recordings first. The courtroom filled with Richard's booming voice threatening to break me, promising to ruin me, demanding signatures on forged documents. Gasps rippled through the benches. My mother sat behind him, her hands shaking as tears slid down her cheeks. Richard's lawyer tried to argue that the recordings were taken out of context, that I was a manipulative young woman exaggerating discipline. Mark stood and countered calmly. "Discipline does not break bones. Discipline does not forge signatures. Discipline does not involve fraudulent loans. The judge's expression hardened. Then came the twist I had not expected. The prosecutor announced they had a witness. My heart stopped. From the back of the courtroom, a woman rose. It was our neighbor, Mrs. Grant, a kind woman who had lived across the street for years. She stepped forward and testified that she had heard screaming from our house many times, had seen me running out with bruises, had once nearly called the police herself. Another witness followed our family doctor, who admitted he had suspected abuse for years after seeing the pattern of injuries I brought in. Richard's face drained of color. His carefully constructed mask was crumbling in front of everyone. And then came the moment that nearly broke me. They called my mother to the stand. She walked slowly, eyes downcast, voice trembling. At first, she tried to defend him, saying he was strict, that he sometimes lost his temper, but only because he wanted the best for me. Richard's lawyer nodded eagerly, pushing her along. But then Mark asked one question. "Mrs. Hayes, when your daughter's arm was broken, what did you do?" My mother froze. Her lips trembled. Nothing, she whispered. I did nothing. The silence that followed was deafening. The jury stared at her, the judge leaned forward, and Richard's lawyer paled. In that one confession, my mother exposed not only his violence, but the paralysis of fear that had ruled our home. Richard slammed his fist on the table, but the bailiff silenced him. For the first time, I saw my mother's eyes clear. She looked at me and mouthed, "I am sorry." My heart cracked, but also healed in the same breath. She had chosen me over him at last. That was the twist Richard had never anticipated. His control was unraveling not just in evidence, but in loyalty. When the trial officially began, the courthouse buzzed with tension like electricity before a storm. Reporters hovered outside the marble steps, whispering about the stepfather accused not only of breaking his stepdaughter's arm, but also of forging documents and siphoning money through fraudulent loans. Inside the courtroom, the air was heavy with expectation. I sat at the prosecution table, my arm still wrapped in a cast, my body aching with the memory of every bruise. Richard sat across from me in a dark suit, his hair slicked back, his posture stiff as if he could hold himself together by sheer force of arrogance. But his eyes betrayed him. Each time he glanced at me, I saw the flicker of panic that no amount of grooming could erase. The judge entered, and the trial began. The prosecution opened with a chilling description of the case, painting Richard as a man who had manipulated his wife, silenced his stepdaughter, and then escalated from violence into calculated financial fraud. The jury listened, their eyes sharp, their pens scratching across notepads. Richard's lawyer responded by painting me as a rebellious young woman prone to exaggeration, a girl desperate for attention who wanted to vilify a man simply trying to keep his family in order. But the words sounded hollow even to my ears, and I could tell by the stiff posture of the jury that they were not buying it. When I was called to the stand, my legs trembled, but I forced myself to walk forward. I raised my good hand and swore to tell the truth. Sitting in that chair under the fluorescent lights, facing 12 strangers and the man who had terrorized me for years, I felt my throat tighten. The prosecutor asked me to describe what happened the night my arm was broken. I took a deep breath and told them everything. I spoke of the whistle of the belt, the crack of bone, the boot pressed against my chest. I described my mother frozen in the doorway, her lips trembling with words too weak to stop him. I told them how he hissed that I was worthless, how he demanded my father's money, how he told me everything I owned belonged to him. As I spoke, tears blurred my vision, but I refused to look away from Richard. I wanted him to see that his threats had not silenced me. When the prosecutor asked if I had evidence, I nodded. The courtroom filled with Richard's own voice as the recordings played. His shouts echoed off the walls, the snap of leather against flesh, my own cries. Gasps rippled through the benches. The judge's expression hardened, and I saw the jurors flinch. Richard's lawyer tried to interrupt, objecting that the audio was prejudicial, but the judge silenced him with a sharp look. "This is direct evidence, Mr. Lawrence. It will stand." The lawyer shifted tactics, attacking me in cross-examination. He asked if I had provoked Richard, if I had exaggerated the injuries, if perhaps I had fallen and broken my own arm. His words made my blood boil, but then Mark rose calmly with a medical report signed by the emergency room physician stating clearly that the fracture was consistent with blunt force trauma, not a fall. Richard's lawyer stuttered, then tried to suggest I had forged the documents myself to frame him. That was when the prosecutor unveiled the photos I had taken of the loan applications Richard had left on his desk, my name scrawled in handwriting that clearly was not mine. A handwriting expert testified confirming the forgeries matched Richard's own penmanship. The jury leaned forward, listening closely. Piece by piece, the mask was stripped away. Then came the witnesses. Mrs. Grant, our neighbor, took the stand and testified that she had heard my screams at night, that she had seen me rushing out with bruises, that she had once nearly called the police. Our family doctor followed, explaining the pattern of suspicious injuries I had come to him with over the years. Richard's face drained of color, his mask crumbling. But the most powerful testimony came when my mother Linda was called again. She walked slowly to the stand, her hands shaking, her voice trembling. At first, she tried to defend him, her words halting, but then the prosecutor asked the same devastating question from the preliminary hearing. When your daughter's arm was broken, what did you do? Tears streamed down her face as she whispered nothing. I did nothing. The courtroom fell silent. Richard's lawyer buried his face in his notes, but the damage was done. My mother lifted her gaze and for the first time looked straight at Richard. I was afraid, she said, but fear is no excuse. I saw what you did to Anna. I saw how you tried to steal from her. I cannot protect you anymore. Her words landed like thunder. Richard slammed his fist on the table and shouted, "Liar," but the judge's gavel struck sharply. One more outburst and you will be removed from this courtroom. Richard sat back, breathing hard, his face purple with rage, but the jury had already seen the truth. Closing arguments came swiftly. The prosecutor's voice rang out clear. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not discipline. This is domination through violence. This is not a family man. This is a predator who believed he could silence his stepdaughter with fists and fraud. But the truth is stronger. The truth is here in this courtroom, and it demands justice. Richard's lawyer tried to spin sympathy, portraying him as a man under stress, a husband struggling to manage finances, but the jury's stony faces told the story. They deliberated for only 3 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood his voice firm. On the charge of aggravated assault, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of domestic abuse, guilty. On the charge of financial fraud, guilty. On the charge of intimidation and coercion, guilty. Each word was a nail in Richard's coffin. He slumped in his chair, his mouth opening and closing without sound. The judge announced sentencing would occur the following week, but Richard was remanded into custody immediately. The bailiffs approached and Richard turned to me, desperation etched across his face. Anna, please, he whispered. Do not let them do this. You know I did not mean to hurt you. My chest tightened, but not with fear, with clarity. I stood tall and said you meant every word, Richard, and now every word is your prison. The bailiffs cuffed him and dragged him away, his shouts echoing down the hall. For the first time, I felt the weight lifting. The day of sentencing, the courtroom was packed. The judge's words were stern. Richard Hayes, your actions show a pattern of cruelty, greed, and violence. You attempted to strip your stepdaughter of her inheritance. You committed fraud. You inflicted lasting harm. This court sentences you to 10 years in state prison. Richard's knees buckled, the guards holding him upright as his face twisted in shock. 10 years, a decade where he could not raise his fist or shout me into silence. My mother wept softly in the benches, but I knew this time they were tears of release. As Richard was led away, reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashed, and I walked out into the sunlight free for the first time in years. The climax was not only his conviction, it was the reversal of power. The man who had ruled my life with fear now sat shackled by his own arrogance, exposed to the world. I thought the gavel had ended it that day in court, but Richard's shadow did not vanish when the cell door closed behind him. It reached for me through letters, phone calls, and whispers that seeped into my life like smoke. 2 days after sentencing, a guard delivered a letter to my lawyer's office scrawled on lined prison paper, the handwriting jagged with fury. Anna, "You have destroyed me. You should be proud," he wrote. "You left your mother alone. You ruined this family, but prison will not break me. I will get out, and when I do, you will regret everything." My hands shook as I read it, but instead of fear, I felt a strange, bitter laugh rising in my throat because even locked in a concrete cage, he still believed his words held power. I handed the letter to Mark, and within hours, the district attorney filed additional charges, intimidation of a witness adding years to his sentence. The very threats he thought would frighten me only tightened the chains around him. But Richard was not finished. A week later, I began receiving anonymous calls late at night, heavy breathing silence, then a click. Once, a voice muttered, "We know where you are." At first, I dismissed it as prank calls, but then, one afternoon, I noticed a black sedan parked across from my apartment, two men inside pretending to read newspapers. My stomach twisted. Mark urged me to contact the police, and within days, detectives confirmed my suspicion. Richard had reached out from prison using connections from his fraudulent financial schemes, men with ties to criminal networks who owed him favors. He was trying to intimidate me from behind bars. The police installed temporary surveillance near my building, and the car vanished, but the message was clear: Richard was still dangerous, even caged. The district attorney moved swiftly, petitioning the judge for stricter monitoring of his communications. Phone calls were cut to minutes, letters screened, visitors restricted, and still more evidence surfaced. Investigators uncovered that the shell companies Richard used to funnel loans were linked to a broader ring of financial crimes stretching across state lines. What began as a case of domestic abuse had widened into a criminal investigation of fraud networks. Agents from the FBI became involved, questioning me about documents I had photographed about names that appeared on Richard's paperwork. It was dizzying to realize my stepfather, who once used a belt to keep me silent, had tangled himself in webs large enough to draw federal attention. The irony was sharp. His arrogance had not only destroyed his control over me, it had exposed him to forces far beyond his reach. And yet the danger to me was real. Mark arranged for a protective order ensuring I was notified of any movement in Richard's case. Detectives assured me the men in the sedan had been identified and warned, but I slept lightly for weeks listening for footsteps outside my window. My mother called me during that time, her voice thin from guilt. "Anna, he wrote to me too. She confessed. He told me you were lying, that you twisted everything." I asked her what she believed, and after a long silence, she whispered, "I believe you now. I should have long ago." It did not erase the years of silence, but it mattered that she said it. The additional charges against Richard meant his sentence stretched to 13 years and possibly more if the federal fraud case went through. Word filtered back to me from inside prison that he was not faring well, that other inmates despised men who brutalized women. I will not pretend I lost sleep over that. Justice sometimes arrives in ways the system cannot script. Still, I knew enough to recognize danger. Richard might spend over a decade behind bars, but networks of greed do not vanish overnight. Mark advised me to keep building my case publicly to ensure that if anything happened to me, suspicion would immediately fall on the right place. So I agreed to one interview. I sat in a small studio across from a local journalist and told my story in measured words. I spoke about broken bones hidden behind closed doors, about mothers paralyzed by fear, about forged papers and stolen identities. I ended by holding up my cast and saying, "This is not just my arm. This is every victim who thought their pain would never matter." The interview aired and messages flooded in from women and men across the country, survivors thanking me, strangers offering support, organizations inviting me to speak. By stepping into the light, I had done more than protect myself. I had robbed Richard of the silence he had depended on. Every threat he had made, every attempt to intimidate me now, boomeranged back as evidence of his guilt. The danger was real, but so was the power of exposure. One evening, as I walked home from class, the street lamps buzzing above me, I thought about the journey from that living room floor where my arm snapped to this moment. Richard had tried to erase me with violence, then with fraud, then with threats from prison, and yet here I was, still standing, still speaking, still building. He was trapped behind walls, writing furious letters while I was walking free beneath an open sky. That was the truest justice of all. The weeks after Richard's conviction stretched into months, and though the bruises on my body slowly faded, the marks on my spirit were harder to erase. At first, I would wake in the middle of the night, heart pounding, certain I heard the crack of a belt against wood or the thud of boots approaching my door. I would sit in the dark, clutching my cast, until I remembered he was locked away and I was free. Slowly, the fear gave way to something steadier determination. I knew I could not allow my life to be defined by the violence he left behind. My mother, Linda, struggled more than I did. She had lived under his control for nearly a decade, and when the silence finally settled over the house, she moved through it like a ghost, unsure how to breathe without his voice dictating her every move. She cried often, blaming herself for not protecting me for standing by while he tore me apart. At first, resentment burned in me, but over time, I saw the truth. She had been broken too, not with fists, but with years of psychological chains. She began attending counseling sessions required by the court, and week by week, she came back to life. She laughed again, sometimes quietly, but it was a start, and I realized healing was not just for me, it was for her too. Meanwhile, the community buzzed with my story. Neighbors who once smiled politely now looked at me with a mix of pity, admiration, and guilt. Some admitted they had suspected something but did not want to interfere. Others swore they had no idea what was happening behind closed doors. Their words did not matter anymore. What mattered was that Richard could never hurt me again. Reporters reached out daily, eager to turn my ordeal into headlines. At first, I wanted nothing to do with them, but Mark reminded me that telling my story could protect others, that silence had protected Richard and exposure was what destroyed him. So I agreed. I spoke on local television about domestic abuse, about the importance of evidence, about the courage it takes to speak. The interview spread further than I expected, reaching other states' other survivors. Emails poured in from women thanking me for giving them hope, for showing them they were not alone. Each message was a reminder that my pain could be transformed into purpose. I decided then to use part of my inheritance from my father, not just for myself, but to help others. With Mark's guidance, I founded a small organization dedicated to supporting victims of domestic violence. At first, it was just a rented office with peeling paint and 2 volunteers, but soon, lawyers reached out offering pro bono services. Shelters partnered with us, and survivors came through our doors carrying the same haunted look I once wore. We provided emergency housing, legal aid counseling. Every time I handed someone a resource, I felt stronger. Richard had tried to strip me of everything, but instead he had given me the fire to build something bigger than myself. The consequences for him continued to unfold. His threats from prison added 3 more years to his sentence, and federal investigators dug deeper into his fraud networks. Rumors circulated that he faced potential federal charges that could extend his time even further. Word reached me that prison was unkind to men like him, and I will not lie. I slept more soundly, knowing that fear now belonged to him. One afternoon, my mother visited me with trembling hands, clutching a letter. It was from Richard, begging her to convince me to drop the additional charges, promising he still loved us both. She handed it to me without opening it, her eyes firm. "I do not believe him anymore," she said. I burned the letter without a second glance. My energy was needed for better things. I returned to college, walking across campus with my cast still visible but my chin lifted high. People whispered, recognizing me from the news, but I no longer lowered my head in shame. I was not just a victim. I was a survivor. Professors invited me to speak in classes about resilience and justice. I discovered a strength in my voice I had never known. Late at night, when the house was quiet, I walked through the rooms that had once been cages and now felt like spaces of freedom. I remembered the fear, the nights of trembling, the sound of belts against wood, and I let the memories wash over me, not to weaken me, but to remind me of how far I had come. My mother and I slowly rebuilt our relationship. She apologized often, sometimes through tears, sometimes through silence. I did not forgive her immediately, but over time I saw the courage it took for her to face her own complicity. We attended therapy together, and though the scars remained, they became reminders of survival, not chains of guilt. The foundation grew faster than I expected. Within a year, we secured funding from donors moved by my story. We opened a shelter for women escaping abuse, naming it The Haven. On opening day, I cut the ribbon with tears streaming down my cheeks, surrounded by survivors who had found safety within our walls. I realized then that Richard's violence had not only broken my arm, it had broken the silence for dozens of others. That was his unintended consequence. Justice did not end in the courtroom it lived on in every life I touched. National media soon picked up the story. I was invited to speak on panels about domestic violence, to testify before local government committees about stronger laws. Standing there with cameras flashing, I thought about the girl who once whispered in fear behind a locked bedroom door. She had become the woman standing in the light, refusing to be silenced. Richard's name became synonymous with shame, while mine became tied to resilience. The irony was sharp. He once told me I was worthless, and now his existence was remembered only because of me. In the quiet moments, I returned to painting something I had abandoned years earlier. I transformed Richard's old study into an art studio with white walls, sunlight streaming through the windows, and canvases leaning against every corner. One day, I painted a woman standing tall with one arm in a sling, her face turned toward the sun. It was me, but it was also every woman who had survived. The colors were bold, unapologetic. Looking at it, I felt something inside me settle. That painting became the centerpiece of my healing. The consequences of Richard's crimes stretched further than his prison sentence. His reputation destroyed, his finances seized, his future reduced to steel bars and shame. My consequences were freedom, voice, and purpose. I was no longer the girl broken on the floor. I was the woman standing in her own light. If you are still here listening to me, then maybe you have known fear like mine, the kind that lives in your bones and whispers that no one will ever believe you. Maybe you have hidden bruises under long sleeves or swallowed words at the dinner table because silence felt safer. Maybe someone you love has convinced you that your voice is small, but I promise you it is not. My stepfather tried to silence me with fists, threats, and forged papers, but the truth carried me further than his violence ever could. Today he sits in a prison cell counting the years, while I stand free, using my story to help others. Every scar on my body is proof not of weakness, but of survival. If you are hurting, if someone has told you that you are powerless, remember that silence protects only the abuser, not you speak. Record, reach out. Find the one person who will believe you, because once the truth steps into the light, it cannot be chained again. And if my story has meant something to you, share it, subscribe, tell your own story in the comments, because your voice matters and it might be the light someone else is waiting for.